completely used to doing online classes. It's just weird not having the people directly in front of me. Okay. What do we got? Gotcha. All right. So yeah, as I mentioned, once we finish this chapter, we'll do the study guide and have the test the following class. We'll probably get about halfway through the chapter today, at which point I will post the PowerPoint up on Blackboard and the study guide as well. That doesn't mean the next class will be the test, because we will still have the rest of the PowerPoint to go through. I mean, unless we come to a point where we have like 1 or 2 slides left, typically for at least the first test, I tend to dedicate a whole class period to going over the study guide, just so you guys will know what I'm going to do to you for the first test. So just FYI, that's what's going on. So earliest, I mean, I guess technically we could possibly get through almost all of the chapter today and finish up on Monday and do the study guide and maybe have the test next Wednesday, but I don't see that happening. So probably going to finish the chapter on Monday, do the study guide next Wednesday, and then have the test that following week. So that's what we're looking at. So, any questions from you guys? Great. All right. So, we only really just started this chapter. I mean, technically I'm on slide 2, but the first slide was, the title page, so that doesn't really count. Got into the English colonies, Charles II giving land to his allies, such as, his brother James, technically Admiral Sir William Penn's son, William Penn Jr., so you got Pennsylvania, as well as the, East and West Jersey, which we have here. And these became proprietary colonies where they had a bit more freedom to kind of do what they wanted, at least from, British oversight. Although, again, local issues, which is to say things like the Bacon Rebellion, made it so that they couldn't just decide they're going to have their own little medieval fiefdom and do whatever they want, because the locals would only allow them so much power. Also, as I've mentioned several times, South Carolina was an offshoot of Barbados, so it was more tied in with the stuff going on in the Caribbean as opposed to like the rest of the North American colonies. So we'll get to that a little bit later. And as I showed you guys, the colonies look real weird early on. We'll get into, where is my mouse? Over here, okay. We'll get into them being a little more standardized a little bit later. And there's William Penn, or William Penn Jr. technically, Quaker Oats guy, and Philadelphia being planned out more so than a lot of the other cities at the time. We have even surveyors. And then, of course, it was just called Carolina. They didn't split it until a little bit later, which, again, we'll get into. Speaking of which, Pennsylvania was growing quickly. As we'd said, they had religious toleration for Christians, friendly relations with the natives. They set up a voting policy where all land owning men could vote, which was relatively normal for the colonies. So then we have some issues over in England. We already saw, England having a bit of a civil war over Charles I and his Catholic wife, and et cetera, et cetera. And as I said, the religion of the mother dictates the religion of the child. So I guess James was that particular wife's child, so he was Catholic. It's not like he, was born Protestant and then converted to the Catholicism. He was just born Catholic, and that was just like, as a rule, he was Catholic. It's weird. And again, as I mentioned prior, this was an issue due to how things worked in Europe, where the religion of the ruler dictated the religion of the kingdom. But by this point, Protestantism, or technically Anglicanism, was so entrenched in English culture that having a Catholic ruler would be very difficult. That said, James coming to power did cause a lot of changes. He put a lot of Catholic people in high positions of power and did try to change things. Not to the extent that people feared he would, until he had a son. Because there was this agreement that, okay, well, James can be on the throne until he dies, and then it'll be passed to one of his Protestant daughters, because again, weird religious stuff. But then he ended up having a Catholic son, which again would usurp the Protestant daughters, and Parliament freaked out again. But rather than having another civil war, hey, here is William of Orange. We're back to William of Orange. They had James's Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange come in and take over instead. I say this was a mostly bloodless coup because, of course, Ireland rose up in support of James, because James was Catholic and Ireland's Catholic, and if they can have a Catholic on the English throne, then maybe they would not be treated like garbage. Obviously, this led to a lot of Irish getting killed. But in the so-called Glorious Revolution, William of Orange and Mary became constitutional monarchs, which was super important for not only England, but like monarchy in general, because it meant that you could still have a monarchy but also have a representative government. So rather than you having the king, and in this case, the king and queen shared power over the government, you had them ruling alongside Parliament. So this was more akin to, I guess what we'd see today with, like, in our government, you had the executive branch and then the legislative branch. Parliament's the legislative branch, and for them, the monarchy was the executive branch. This was before they had, the prime minister, which took over for the executive branch, and now I was going to say the queen. The queen's now actually dead. The king is just a worthless figurehead that doesn't do anything. William and Mary reestablished freedoms in the colonies that had been hampered by James, reinforcing royal charters, and also made some of these colonies that were sort of blobby into more distinct colonies. So this is what I was mentioning just a moment ago. East and West Jersey became New Jersey. Carolina became North and South Carolina. Georgia, Delaware, Massachusetts, and several colonies that were already expanding were now given more definitive borders. So, I mean, overall, this was a positive thing. I mean, unless you were, Irish, which there wasn't a lot of positive Irish history. But for the overall social structure of the day, it was pretty positive. So again, we have folks in Pennsylvania getting along pretty well with the natives. Here we have James in England before he got chased out. And here we have them welcoming not Charles, William of Orange. And like it was a big deal. Like here you've got, an image of William of Orange with like Poseidon back here and a creepy little cherub baby up in the clouds. I hate cherub babies. They weird me out. So here is William and Mary with the holy hand grenade there. And then we had the creation of North and South Carolina. As you can see, the border here is a little bit different than it is today, but at least we have a border. And then Georgia was very small when it started out, but the northern border is the same. The northeastern border, the Savannah River, which was mostly there as a buffer zone between the Carolinas and Spanish Florida, which we'll also get into a little bit later. Also, I would like to mention, let me just bring this back up real quick. So you've got, this is all the land that they're claiming, this far in and all of that, and, we've got Virginia and then all these states further north. But as far as what's actually settled, it's mostly coastline stuff. And that the lighter stuff is what's claimed, which again is mostly just coastline stuff, but not stuff that's actually really settled. So when I talk about frontier, I'm talking about this stuff. I'm talking about not very far inland. You're still getting sea breeze, essentially. Up here we've got a bit more inland. You've got the Puritans and the Pilgrims that have made a bit more inroads into Massachusetts, probably through those multiple wars they've had with the natives. But for the most part, when we talk about heading west to the frontier, it's like here. It's not Ohio. It's here. So that's England. Of course, France and Spain are still around. In Europe, France was at the strongest it would ever be under a monarch. Now, obviously, Napoleon comes along and really brings France to its apex. But as far as under a monarch, Louis XIV was probably the most power France ever had in terms of a kingdom. Again, though, as far as North American expansion, it was mostly just exploration. They set up some forts here and there, like they usually did, but there was no it wasn't like with the English setting up, settlements and having farms and plantations and cities and stuff. 1682, we briefly mentioned this, but the book finally did give us the guy's name. Sieur de La Salle explored the Mississippi and claimed all the lands drained by its tributaries, which meant that any rivers that fed into the Mississippi, and therefore any lands that those rivers touched, were now called Louisiana, which again is like a third of what is now the United States. That was a lot of land. But he was unable to create a permanent settlement. He tried to make, I don't remember exactly, a development stalled when he failed to establish a colony. So it didn't even really say like where he tried to build the colony. It didn't especially matter. There was the Canadian military officer Pierre Lemon de Iberville. French names, man. Established forts at Biloxi and Mobile Bays, mostly as trading posts with the local Choctaw natives. And both of those forts are still around today. I imagine they've probably been somewhat restored, but at least one of them is really close to the waterline, and considering it's on the Gulf of Mexico, I imagine the hurricanes are a nightmare. But yeah, it's a bit like with Fort Sumter, where you can go and visit. You got it? Okay. Still, though, again, there wasn't like a huge influx of French settlers coming to North America like it was with the English, and their small population would allow, which is to say, since they set up forts instead of towns and were friendly with the natives instead of fighting them, like the Spanish, they were able to just have these small little forts here and there, and they could command essentially power over a large area. And with the natives especially, if there were, say, English or Spanish snooping around, the natives would see them way before the French would, and they could come to the fort and be like, hey, there's some white men roaming around, and they're probably not yours, because we know what you guys dress like. And the French would be able to jump on that without having to expend many resources. So, again, the French were doing a pretty good job without sending like hundreds of thousands of people to North America. And also without like genociding the natives. So they were doing a pretty good middle ground of not sending a bunch of people and not murdering a bunch of people. Which is weird because Louis XIV here liked murdering people. But he typically kept it to Europe. So here is La Salle's travels through the Great Lakes, and then down the Illinois rivers, and eventually down the Mississippi, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, and then eventually they came back, arrived in Texas, and then he got himself killed. The book doesn't really go into what happened there, but yes, it's not a huge deal. Here we go. So this first one is Biloxi. So you've got the Biloxi fort, which again, you've got erosion. So there's the the ocean is beating up on the wall, which is not good if you want that fort to stick around. And then for Mobile, they have fortified it much more, and they've got, sea breaks and They've built. I know a lot of this land is filler that has been brought in to specifically keep this from happening. So this one's in a lot better shape. So once again, this map here, this happens after a war we'll get into a little bit later. But you've got, for the most part, the English here on the East Coast, the French through Canada, and eventually down here through Louisiana. And you can see the forts. These little cannons here are representative of forts. And then the Spanish down here in Mexico, and then here in the southeast, southwest rather. And as we're going to see here in just a minute, once again, they don't get very far. So, speaking of that, the Pueblo revolted again. Facing tensions with the Pueblo, as they were unable to protect them from disease, hostile tribes, and famine, which was the whole reason the Pueblo were putting up with the Spanish, because they were supposed to have been able to protect them from disease, hostile natives, and famine. So many Pueblo returned to their old practices because, the Spanish were like, oh yeah, our God can do anything. And, well, the Spanish God wasn't helping them very much. So they figured they'd go back to what they had been doing. So the Spanish punished, and by punished, I mean, let's see, when some of the Pueblos returned to their traditional priests, Spanish officials hanged 3 native leaders for idolatry and whipped and incarcerated 43 others. So, in response, 17,000 Pueblo natives initiated a coordinated assault on numerous Spanish missions and forts, destroyed buildings and farms, burned crops and houses, smeared excrement on Christian altars. The Spaniards retreated to Mexico without launching any significant counterattack. They did eventually return, reconquer parts of New Mexico, aided by a growing internal conflict, etc., etc. Franciscan missionaries established better relations by allowing the Pueblo to retain more indigenous practices and built new missions in the region. However, interestingly enough, the revolt led to other tribes becoming more powerful. In the aftermath of the revolt, some Pueblo refugees moved north and taught the Navajos how to grow corn, raise sheep, and ride horses. Through the Navajos, the Ute and Comanche peoples also gained access to horses. By the 1730s, the Comanches, who had become fully equestrian society, launched mounted bison hunts and traded over vast areas. One key trading center was formed at the Taos, northern New Mexico, where Spanish control was weak. Comanches sold captives as slaves, gained more horses, metal tools, and guns. So, due to the Pueblo getting out of the Spanish control, but taking what they had learned from the Spanish into other tribes essentially learned knowledge from the Spanish, like through secondhand exposure, and then use that knowledge to cause more problems for the Spanish. Because again, horses were not native to North America, yet Native Americans were really good at learning how to use horses very quickly. And that caused significant trouble for Europeans and then later Americans. Meanwhile, over in Texas, Spanish were building forts to try to oppose the French because, again, the French were coming down the Mississippi and Once you've spread west of the Mississippi, you're essentially in Texas. However, the Apache tribe is in that region, and they were far too strong for the Spanish to simply roll in and do whatever they wanted. So the Spanish were not able to maintain full strength there either. And in Florida, once again, the natives kept the Spanish from maintaining a real solid foothold. Natives actively resisted, and others would move north into English territories with promises of alliances against the Spanish. Because once again, if you're near like a border and you're working against one European power, you can just jump that border and work with the other European power because they're typically not getting along. So Spain's not doing so good. Despite their vast empire. I mean, not to mention essentially all of Central and South America. But I mean, all of that falls within a few decades of the American Revolution. So here they are negotiating with the Pueblo. And here the Pueblo are returning the favor. And then the Spanish eventually coming back. I believe this is, actually I think this is the Spanish in Texas. And this is supposed to be the Spanish in Florida. Because once again, the Seminole in Florida did not play around. This dude's about to get domed. So, this was just, I mean, this was a lot of conflict with the natives, but this was just Spain. So between the European powers, there was a lot of conflict because, again, it's Europe, and Europe's constantly, all the European powers are constantly fighting each other. So France was a major power in Europe, and by 1689, what was known as King William's War spread to North America. Now this was a war between France and England, which, if there's a war in this time period, it's usually between France and England. Or it's some combination of somebody and somebody, but France and England are typically fighting each other. It's very, very rare that they're working together. The Spanish Armada is the only example of like England and Spain are fighting each other, and France is like off to the side, hoping that England wins, but not getting involved. So this war began in Europe, but it spread to North America when the English and their Iroquois allies attacked the French and their Huron allies around Montreal and northern New York, because again, as we're going to see with the horribly named French and Indian War, which I will not be calling the French and Indian War, the English had plenty of native allies of their own. Now, by the time this war was done, not much land had really changed hands. Neither side had really gained much land. However, by the time peace was declared, so many natives had been killed that the Iroquois decided that they were going to remain neutral in all future conflicts. They weren't going to be involved in anything because despite the fact that they were a fairly powerful tribe, they had lost so many people that they knew another war or two and they weren't going to have anybody left. Meanwhile, well, not meanwhile, but a few years later, I mean, this is not that long later, we had the War of Spanish Succession, which was also called Queen Anne's War. I don't know why it was called Queen Anne's War. I'm not sure who Queen Anne was specifically. The War of Spanish Succession is another example of Spain's not really in the limelight anymore, but due to everybody in Europe, oh, well, I shouldn't say everybody in Europe, all the royals in Europe being inbred, since the Spanish king died without any heirs, the next closest heir was like French royalty. So there was this concern that the French and Spanish crowns would be united, and all the other European powers were like, you can't do this because a like combined French-Spanish super country essentially would throw off the balance of power in Europe, and everybody freaked the fuck out, and it led to England fighting against France and Spain, although in Europe it was like everybody against France and Spain. In America it was just England against France and Spain, as well as, of course, lots of native allies who were typically the ones on the front lines getting killed. Well, England managed to win this, got quite a bit of land, but this was not like some decisive victory that would maintain peace for the future. Everybody knew that there would be another war, and as soon as the war was over, everybody started building forts on the borders of their new territory in preparation for the next conflict. This is a real good like snapshot into my European history class. It's just constant wars over nonsense. Though typically less native genocide. It's just Europeans killing each other for no reason. So there's King William's War, which was just a lot of back and forth up here in the Northeast, between New England and Canada, which I guess was technically called New France at the time. Oh, right. I keep forgetting I've got this image. This feels like this feels like art from Sid Meier's Pirates because, well, for one, everybody looks the same, but also they're color-coded. Like there's, like the guys on the left here in red are the British, and the guys here on the right in the blue are the French, and I'm pretty sure, I think the green was supposed to be the Dutch. If there was anybody in yellow, those would have been the Spanish. But this is how everybody looked, all the nobles in Sid Meier's Pirates looked. And that's a really old game. If you know what Sid Meier's Pirates is, you've played a very old game. But everybody was color-coded. It was, so you could tell the countries apart because this is exactly what they look like. It was so weird. And I found this, like, I've got to include it because this looks like a 20-year-old game at this point. So here's, the natives and the colonials sneaking up on a fort. You can see here, they've got like, I don't know if there's like snowmen or like cutouts or whatever, but they're meant to look like sentries from a distance, so you think they've got guards setting up if you're like watching from the tree line. which is an interesting detail to include. Oh, here we are. So after the war of Spanish Succession, see all these lines here, all along all of this? All of that is disputed territory, which means stuff they're going to fight about later. So, yeah, that's not great. There's another one here. So the French there in the middle, and this territory actually becomes a big deal pretty soon, actually, once we get to the 7 Years' War. Obviously, the natives weren't too keen on the whole, like, dying for the sake of Europeans. And this is something that, again, should you take my European course, you'll see a lot of, where European powers will move into a region and the natives there, you see this a lot in India specifically, the native people there will use the European powers against their traditional rivals. So, yeah. Traditional allies. I messed that up. They're traditional enemies, rather. Because they see, hey, there's these people coming in. They've got guns and horses and, like, metal weapons. They've got stuff that are better than what we have, and they're willing to fight with us against our enemies, and our enemies are working with another group that are like these guys that have tools and weapons and stuff. So if we don't work with these guys, we're going to get crushed. So, you're sort of caught in the middle at this point. Unfortunately, all this caused yet more tension between the tribes, especially in regions like Canada and the Northeast, where the main source of trade was animal furs. Because if you've got all these tribes going out and killing animals and skinning them for furs, you're going to run out of animals. And once they did, the only thing that they had to trade to Europeans were slaves taken in raids. So the tribes start becoming more aggressive towards one another and raiding one another to take slaves to trade with Europeans for more of these tools. Because, again, they can't manufacture guns and gunpowder and iron tools or anything like that. They have to trade them with the Europeans to get more. Once they break or run out of gunpowder or ammunition, they have to go get more. So we mentioned King Philip's War. King Philip's War already. Metacom up in the northeast. However, there was also a native alliance down in the Carolinas that tried to kick the Europeans out. However, the colonists down in the Carolinas managed to gain their own native alliances. And in the war by 1713, I think it was the Yamasee War? No, that's the next one. I got ahead of myself. They don't really talk about the name of that first war. It was the Yamasee War that was an even greater threat than King Philip's War, because the population down in the south was much smaller than in the north. So it didn't take that big of a native push to cause significant threat to the southern colonists. In fact, it was only the Cherokee switching sides to the colonials that allowed them to win the war by 1716. And the only reason the Cherokee switched sides was because the Creek and Caddo were fighting against the colonists, and the Creek and Caddo tribes were like ancestral enemies of the Cherokee, and they couldn't stomach working with them. So they decided to work with the colonists instead. And boy, do we screw them over later anyway. So the Creek and Caddo tribes allied with the French because obviously their enemies, their sworn enemies, the Cherokee, were working with the English. Because again, that's just how it works. So again, we've got images here. I don't know who brought the baby to the battlefield, but he's not doing so good. And I don't know what this is, but it is about to end this dude's day. I mean, he's not holding his sword right, so he kind of deserves it. I guess here we have the Cherokee having a chat with the colonial militia. Tuscarora, that was the name of the first war, which again the book doesn't go into, so you guys don't need to worry about. The Yamasee War is the only one that really goes into detail. So here we have the Yamasee War, some of the major battles, and as you can see, they got really close to the few big cities we had at the time, because again, like Columbia wasn't a thing. I don't even think Savannah was a thing yet. Like we had Port Royal and Charlestown, and that was about it. Like there wasn't much in the South yet. So here we have not in English. But this is one of the battles of said war. Now, there's another group that is suffering from all of this. I mean, obviously, again, the natives being caught in the middle of all these conflicts between European powers are having it the worst. There's another group that feels like they're being forced into conflicts against their will, and it was something that I never really thought about, but it makes sense. Many of the colonists themselves felt like they shouldn't be forced to fight all these wars because England wasn't really sending soldiers to fight the wars. They were just like, oh, the colonists are there, you'll be fine. And the colonists, and this isn't like, say, with France and Spain where they're all soldiers, they're colonists. They're growing tobacco and rice and indigo and catching cod and cutting lumber and, trying to convert natives, the Puritans and stuff. They weren't soldiers typically. I mean, we of course had soldiers, but not many, not professional soldiers. And a lot of the settlers here in the European or in the British colonies weren't English. A lot of them came from other parts of Europe. We had lots of Germans. We had lots of Scots-Irish, which especially didn't like the English. We had Dutch. We had a lot of folks that were settling because they could, but they had no particular dog in the fight when it came to the British. Now, as we're going to see, especially when it comes to the American Revolution, the people that came over felt loyal to like their colony or maybe even their city specifically. But there was no greater loyalty to, say, the colonies as a whole. That's why the idea of like America as a single unit almost didn't work out, because everybody's like, oh, we've got our colony and we're fine here. Why do we need a whole thing? But at the same time, that also meant they didn't really feel much loyalty to England, because they had their colony and they were cool, and that was enough. One such example was down in Georgia. Georgia was created by James Oglethorpe. It was meant to be he hoped to provide small farms for Britain's poor. Initially, slavery was outlawed. Land grants usually consisted of 50 to 100 acres. Despite noble intentions, Spanish authorities were furious at this expansion of British territorial claims, because again, they're getting near Spanish Florida, and if you get anywhere near the Spanish get a little pissy. Well, it wasn't just this, though. The Spanish didn't attack Georgia because Georgia was there. In August of 1739, a Spanish naval ship captured an English ship captain who was trading illegally in the Spanish West Indies and severed his ear. Now, this sounds harsh, but to be fair, like in the 1700s and like nautical punishment, that was pretty common. Like you catch a dude doing illegal shipping in your territory and you cut his ear off, they could have killed him. They could have sunk his whole boat. But they cut the dude's ear off and let him go. Honestly, it could have been worse. In response, Great Britain attacked St. Augustine and Cartagena, which is down in modern-day Colombia, the country, not our capital. But its troops were repulsed. So in response to that, the Spanish sent troops to the closest English settlement they could find, which was Georgia. Georgia didn't have anything to do with the British attacking the Spanish, but of course the Spanish aren't going to send troops to freaking Britain. So all this led to Spanish invading Georgia. However, there was a apparently really good militia in Georgia, and with no help from the British, they managed to hold off and push back the Spanish invasion. And I've got a map that I found that none of this is mentioned in the book, but the map has some really interesting details that probably help explain how they were able to kick the Spanish out. So I'll get to that in just a second. Meanwhile, the French and Spanish were using native allies in greater numbers to bolster their numbers in wars, while the British were largely using European immigrants, such as the Germans and Irish. This is another little interesting detail. So let's see. Many Anglo-Americans moved westward as coastal areas became overcrowded. Frontier regions also attracted immigrants from Scotland and Germany, sought refuge and economic opportunity in the colonies. Had officials recruited Swiss, German, and French Huguenots. Does it say why? Settle on the Pedee River and other inland waterways. That's the western frontier, is the Pedee River. It doesn't go into great detail. So, one of the reasons why there was Germans, Irish, and Scots being sent to the frontier, for one, they weren't really welcome in the cities because racism, because they weren't English, so you can't be in the cities. You're not civilized enough, because they're Germans and Irish. They're the stereotype is that they drink and are violent, And, well, if they drink and are violent, put them on the frontier where they can drink and be violent to natives that try to invade from the frontier. And to be fair, like, they did a good job. When the natives just try to come in and attack from the west, the Scots, Irish, and Germans tended to keep them busy. So it worked. Sometimes stereotypes work, I guess. Which, as someone of German-Irish stock, sometimes it works. Let's see. So here's Oglethorpe. Here's, again, like this little tiny bit of land that was Georgia at first. Okay, so here's this map. On the morning of July 7th, 1742, the Spanish suffered a defeat near Fort Frederica at Gully Hole Creek. Hours later, the Scottish Highlanders led the ambush here at Bloody Marsh, some horrifying names, routing the Spanish reinforcements sent to cover the retreat at Gully Hole Creek. Dual disasters proved fatal to the Spanish invasion of St. Simon's Island. The Georgian militia had Scottish Highlanders. And if you're not familiar with Scottish Highlanders, they tend to be really big and really mean. Really mean to their enemies. You don't want to be on the wrong side of a Scottish Highlander. And especially if these guys had their claymores, swords that tend to be as big as them, they're not somebody you mess with. And I would understand why it was called the Bloody Marsh by the time they were done. So here's a quick map of relative ethnicities. So you've got, the English and Welsh, in these regions here, in Virginia, North Carolina, up here as well. But then you've got, obviously groups of Africans being brought in places where there was lots of slavery. But then you've got like Scots-Irish being further inland, Scottish groups, there's that big group in Georgia there. Germans here in Pennsylvania, the German Dutch, which still, lots of groups there still speak German. Let's see, what am I looking for? The Dutch still here in New York, because it got handed over to the English doesn't mean all the Dutch people moved out, so you still got a large Dutch population there. Yeah, that's it. Then of course lots of other smaller groups, but this is the main excuse me, the main groups. All right. We can get a little further along. So, on to economics. So due to the connections that the colonies had with European powers, the trade that we were doing was essentially global. European taste pushed into global markets, particularly in China. Porcelain, cloth, tea, and sugar, and we'll go into the Opium Wars next semester. Of course, forced African labor allowed for lots of raw and eventually finished products. So North America became largely a producer of raw materials. And as North America started having proper settlements rather than just like homesteads and plantations where stuff was produced. They began consuming goods from the east, silk, calico, porcelain, olive oil, etc. We also began producing stuff for Europe and Asia. And this was something that, again, I wasn't really aware of until I started making stuff to teach this class. There was some vibrant trade within the North American colonies. So, for example, you had New England fishermen, merchants in New York and Charleston, and, well, the plantations down in the Caribbean, all trading amongst themselves. And I've, again, got a map that actually shows a little bit of that. So there was trading within North America, despite the fact that there was very little land travel. It was all like ship trade along the coast and then down in the Caribbean. So it wasn't all just stuff from North America went to Europe. There was stuff happening within North America, which was kind of neat. Oh, also, and while learning about the fact that they found periodicals in North America is not super interesting. It's like, oh, they had newspapers, neat. What that means is kind of cool. So periodicals specifically is like business newspapers, which again is the most boring kind of newspaper. It's like a stock market ticker. But what it does mean is that there was enough important business going on in North America that these newspapers were being shipped to North America so that the businessmen here could know like what the markets needed and what goods were most expensive and what goods needed to be shipped at what time, and essentially that we weren't just some backwoods colony that were only being used for resources like we saw just a few chapters back with mercantilism. We were now like an integral part of this worldwide economy. So that's kind of neat. Now granted, a lot of North America was still like very backwoods, but there were cities that were like proper European trade towns now. So here we have some of the main trade flows. You've got your trade routes and dominant capital largely between Europe and the Caribbean, which actually, here we go. This is what I want to look at a bit more. So, obviously you've got the raw resources going to Europe from not just North America, but also down here in the Caribbean, so sugar, molasses, and rum, or fruits, sorry, with the manufactured goods coming back from Europe. And, of course, slavery coming from Africa with things going back to Africa to pay for that. But then you also have trade between the mainland, I guess you'd say the continent, North America, and the Caribbean. So you've got, flour, fish, and meat for, again, slaves, molasses, and sugar. So there was still a lot of intercolonial trading. And there was also like trading between, say, colonies up here and colonies down here. So even within the continent, because there was enough difference that they would trade by ship along the coast. Which again, it's like something that I'd never really thought about, because I focus more on European stuff. But anyway. Oh hey, there's mercantilism. I might have gotten ahead of myself. So, mercantilism was originally thought up by French finance minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert. The objective was to maintain a favorable balance of trade which is to say to have more gold and silver flowing into the nation than flowing out. So to get this, you would put tariffs on goods, which is to say taxes on stuff coming in from other nations, and focusing on trade within the empire itself. In other words, the way this will be done, if, say, the easiest thing would be to use, say, a barrel of sugar. A barrel of sugar from Britain, let's say it's 50 cents. A barrel of sugar from France is 35 cents. But you put a 20-cent tax on the barrel of sugar from France, therefore it costs more than the barrel of sugar from England, but only due to that tax. The French don't have to pay that tax. The people in England who would buy the French sugar have to pay that tax. So therefore they're going to buy the English because it's cheaper. I'm not going to be too specific here, but people who aren't economists who think that the importing nations pay the tariffs are dumbasses and don't know how the economy works. Obviously, Great Britain benefited the most because they had a massive empire. Navigation Act of 1660 made it so that all trade from the colonies had to go through London first. So if the colonies would be, say, sending stuff to maybe France, it had to go through London first. So London would actually like put fees on them to make extra money. It was almost like a mafia thing. Like they would skim a little money off the top before they sent it out. Eventually, Parliament just straight up outlawed any trading outside the empire, and then used tariffs to make it more expensive for English colonies to use French products. Now, but with the time we have left, so let's say you're in the North American colonies, you're a trader, so you've got a boat, and again, I said a barrel of sugar. Let's say per pound, it's 50 cents for sugar from England, or from the English, say, islands in the Caribbean. But from the French islands, it's 35 cents. But again, if you try to buy them through England, it's more expensive to buy the French sugar. But you've got a boat. What can you do? What can you do to get around that tax? If the French sugar is cheaper in the French islands in the Caribbean, what can you do to get around the tax from the British? Yeah, and if you, say, were to bring it back to America and sell it and make a profit, what would that be called? It's a thing that pirates often do. Well, it's not specifically pirating, because that's like violently taking stuff. This is a slightly more subtle high seas crime. Well, it actually wasn't even always high seas. Yep. People started smuggling, and they made money off of it. It just led to smuggling, and not just here in America. When this mercantilism thing was introduced, there was so much smuggling in Europe. There was lots of smuggling of molasses in the West Indies. John Hancock made his money running rum across the Canadian border. So here's Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Here's a really poor quality image of like the various items going back and forth. This is what I was mentioning, how the colonies were looked at before, where the colonies just like bring the raw resources to the mother country. They're not really seen as independent manufacturers of their own. They're just there to bring resources and food and whatever to their main colony or to their main country. And then you've got this. You've got here where you give raw resources to the main country and you get paid a little, and to get the manufactured goods of those same resources, you have to pay a bunch back. So you're not making anything. You're just losing money. Or you could give the raw resources to other nations and make a lot more, which mercantilism very much does not want you to do. And then, or you can do like me and just steal a PowerPoint slide off the internet. Just have John Hancock here. How did American colonies respond to, or American colonies respond to mercantilism? They became smugglers. So yeah, there's 5 minutes left, and I don't want to do this in the last 5 minutes. So we'll start with that on Monday, which is cheerful. Yeah, we should be able to finish the rest of this on Monday, and then we'll do the study guide on Wednesday, and then we'll do the test. So, yeah, see y'all next week. Have a good weekend.